everyone, this is Julie, the cancer dietitian. If you're not familiar with me, I am a bona fide expert in oncology nutrition. Not only am I a registered dietitian, which is a credentialed profession, by the way, I am also a licensed dietitian nutritionist in the state of North Carolina, and I've been a board certified specialist in oncology nutrition for over 10 years. I'm the creator of CancerDietitian.com and the wellness director for Cancer Services, a nonprofit in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. The Cancer Dietitian podcast is for anyone who has faced a cancer diagnosis or provides care for somebody who has. So by my calculation and experience, that's pretty much everybody. And today I'm going to take on a topic that gets people heated: GMOs. But before we get fired up, I want to encourage you all to take a deep breath and spend some time wandering through the information with me today. I'm going to start with some definitions and then move into a discussion on what the current evidence is that we have to date. Just as a reminder, when you are getting information around food and nutrition, I want you to make sure that you get it from a reliable source, because there are plenty of loud and popular people on internet or TV, radio, but they aren't necessarily experts. So as a reminder, just because it's on the internet doesn't mean it's true. And the way that I present my information, I really focus on providing evidence-based information and in a place where you can go back and check behind me. So I will tell you where I get my information from, and you should be able to look it up and read more about it yourself. I use trusted sources like universities, government health organizations, and nonprofits with strong scientific advisory members. And especially today, as we go through this topic, I will make sure to share with you where I'm getting the information and where you can learn more. Let's go ahead and dive in. We're going to start with the question, what are GMO foods? So many people are confused about what it really means. What does GMO mean? So GMO stands for genetically modified organism. It can be used interchangeably with genetically engineered, or GE. And then I have also recently seen the term bioengineered, which helps to differentiate between different types of genetic modifications. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that. But the first thing to know is that crops can be genetically modified, or they have been genetically modified for years and centuries. There is traditional breeding, which is crossbreeding, where desired genes are inserted with other genetic material, and this just happens naturally. There is times where a crop might change its DNA because of exposure to chemicals or radiation, or because of just random changes in the genome that can be very unpredictable. And those are two areas where we've had genetic modifications for a long time, but some people might consider those, quote, natural. So there's no regulation on those whatsoever. So that has been done for a long time. Things like seedless watermelons would fall into that type of category. And then there's new agriculture technology where we're able to actually target genes and turn them on or off, or insert selected genes into the DNA so that there's a desired outcome. Or we could clip out certain DNA or genes so that we can get a desired outcome. And all three of those are actually regulated techniques and things that have to be tested prior to being put into the food supply. Genetic engineering or genetic modification means that basically the DNA is altered in a plant, and it can happen naturally in nature, and we can also do it from an agriculture technology kind of in a lab standpoint. What are the most common types of modification? There are two major common types of modification. One would be insect-resistant plants, and then the second would be herbicide-resistant plants. So the reason that we would want to modify a plant is so that it has a desired trait. Either it's good for the farmer, so it makes their job easier or more efficient or more cost effective, or because it produces something that consumers want. So seedless watermelons or apples that don't go brown. Those are some examples of when we would use genetic modification to produce a product that a consumer wants. And then the other modifications are generally more for the farming side. It can make crops that have a different trait. Maybe there's an ability to grow food without having to use as much pesticides. So when it comes to herbicide and pesticide resistant plants, when you think about it, an herbicide kills a plant and a pesticide kills a pest or an insect. And so for insect resistant modifications, what they've found is that there's a gene from a bacteria in soil called Bt that they can put in a crop. And that way, when the plant starts, or the pest starts eating the plant, it causes the insect to die when they eat it. That way, the farmer doesn't have to use as many pesticides on their plants. So the two most common insect-resistant genetically modified crops are corn and cotton. And then when it comes to herbicide resistant, so that means resistant to plant killers or weed killers, the crops are engineered, so the most common ones are corn, soybean, and cotton, to be resistant to a certain herbicide. So you may have heard of Roundup Ready corn. And that's where you plant this particular type of corn so that the farmer can then spray for the weeds that are growing up with the plants. It doesn't kill the plant or the corn plant, it only kills the other weeds. And so it's efficient for the farmer. But really, the bottom line when it comes to all of this isn't how we feel about it or if we're afraid of technology. I think the bottom line is, what does the current evidence say about the risks and benefits of genetically modified plants? What I will tell you is a couple of things. First of all, there was a big study done in 2016. The National Academies of Sciences got some really smart people together to review more than 900 studies. They looked at over 20 years of scientific evidence regarding genetically modified organisms, and they found no evidence that there are safety concerns when it comes to genetically modified foods. So even they looked at animal studies, they looked at animals who ate genetically modified foods, and then they've compared, groups of people who ate more genetically modified foods and those who didn't, and didn't find any evidence of effects on human health that were detrimental. So you can look up that study if you'd like. It's from the National Academies of Sciences. It's 2016 report on genetically engineered crops. And basically, the study committee really did find no substantiated evidence of a difference in risk to human health between currently commercialized genetically engineered crops and conventionally bred crops. Nor did it find conclusive cause and effect evidence of environmental problems from the genetically engineered crops. So I think that's important. The other recent meta-analysis, there was one from 2018 that showed that genetically modified corn actually increases crop yields and provides significant health benefits. So I think that those are the bottom lines to me, is that if we look at all the studies that have been done on this, is there any consensus? And yes, there's consensus saying that it's perfectly safe. So that's the bottom line. Now, for those of you who want more, you kind of want to dig more into the information, I think that first of all, we need to talk about why do we even have genetically modified organisms in the first place? Like, we're not just doing this for fun, right? Or somebody who just likes to discover things. We're doing this for a reason. And the reason is that everyone who is born has a right to nutritious and affordable food. That's kind of the big picture on this. And right now we have a growing population in the world and our resources are shrinking. We have to be able to produce enough food efficiently on the same amount of land. And I see that there are ways that we can be more efficient with our land. We can use this technology to produce more food. Farmers, if you don't know a farmer, you might try to get to know one. But farmers are, few and far between, and they have a really hard time making a living and producing food. And so they can use all of these different types of technologies to make it possible for them to continue producing food for our country and for our world. So why do we want to use these? To make the farming easier and to produce more food so that it can be affordable. The other reason that we want to use genetically modified foods is that we can genetically modify a crop to make it more nutritious or to address an issue of malnutrition. So one example of that you might have heard of is about, we call it golden rice, because there are places in the world where people have vitamin A deficiency. And in order to address that, there was a rice that was developed that's genetically modified that has vitamin A in it, so that in these areas, if they start using that type of rice, they can reduce the amount of vitamin A deficiency in that population, which is a pretty big deal. If you're not familiar with the challenges of malnutrition and starvation in certain parts of our world, I would encourage you to look into that and consider how we might be able to help address those issues. So that's one reason why we would use it, along with the farming. So another reason that we would want to use genetically engineered crops is that it potentially could decrease the use of pesticides. And the way that works is that if we have an insect-resistant plant, then the farmer doesn't have to spray as many pesticides to keep the insects under control. And it's pretty interesting. There is some data showing that in India and China, when they used these insect-resistant crops, that there was a decrease of pesticides used to the tune of 40 to 70% less. And also, I think really interesting is that when you use fewer pesticides, then you're also showing better insect biodiversity. So this is another question that people have around genetically modified crops is, well, if you genetically modify it to resist or kill insects, then are you causing environmental changes that would be unintentional but harmful? And what they found with this data was that there was actually better insect biodiversity around where these crops were grown, simply because the farmers didn't have to spray as many pesticides. So it actually allowed for more of the harmless pests to stay around, while the harmful pests were killed simply by, when they tried to eat the crop. So I think that that's an important thing to pay attention to, is that we all want to, reduce our exposure to pesticides. And so genetically modified foods might actually be able to offer that opportunity. The other piece that we would want to look at is that genetically engineered crops do have favorable economic outcomes for producers or farmers in those early years of adoption, which is kind of where we are right now. But we are still kind of waiting to see if it will have that benefit. And a lot of that depends not just on the science, but it depends on the support from governments and from consumers and from the global market in general. So that's also something interesting to keep in mind. I think sometimes we as Americans and those of us in the privileged sort of food world we're not always aware of some of the challenges that there are in other parts of the world. So there was an agriculture scientist who got the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970, Norman Borlaug, and he got that prize for averting malnutrition, famine, and premature death of millions. He worked to create, just by general crop breeding in Mexico, he made some wheat that was much more effective at growing and to really be able to prevent malnutrition in lots of people there. And then he continued on to do other types of agriculture technology. And he spent a lot of time in many different countries. And this is one of his quotes that I think is really important for us to think about. So, he says that some of the environmental lobbyists of the Western nations are the salt of the earth, but many of them are elitist. They've never experienced the physical sensation of hunger. They do their lobbying from comfortable office suites in Washington or Brussels. If they lived just 1 month amid the misery of the developing world, as I have for 50 years, they'd be crying out for tractors and fertilizer and irrigation canals and be outraged that fashionable elitists back home were trying to deny them these things. And that is from an interview with The Atlantic in 1997. So I think that when we have this conversation about GMOs, really thinking about why is it that we would want to use these and what are some of the benefits is really important, and thinking outside of our own circles and understanding what the challenges are maybe in other cultures or other areas of the world. So those are really important discussions to have. The other thing that's important, of course, when we're talking about genetically modified foods is, are there risks? So a lot of people maybe have been told, oh, they're not good for you, but very little detail around that. So I really tried to dig in and figure out, okay, so if there's potential benefits, what are the potential risks? And I think that there's not a lot. There was one study that was published that was actually retracted. So if anybody has heard of or someone mentioned a rat study showing that genetically modified corn caused tumors in rats, it wasn't a very well done trial. It never had results that were replicated. The statistical analysis was questionable, and the journal ended up retracting it and pulling it. And so to me, you can't even consider that because there should be better science to document that. So that was one thing. There is some concern among some that if you put genes from one plant into another plant, is there potential allergies that people could have to a plant that they've not had any trouble with before? And I think that is something worth considering. One of the articles that I read, which was from the University of Utah, the article is titled Genetically Modified Foods. They state that the risk for allergens in new genetically modified foods is actually lower than the risk for allergens in new conventional foods that are introduced to the market because conventional foods don't go through any allergen testing, whereas the genetically modified foods actually have to go through testing. So genetically modified foods go through 3 tests to ensure that proteins in the genetically modified food do not cause allergies. And these tests are mainly based on comparison with other known allergies. That's something to, keep in mind, but also know that it is being tested and looked at more so than other types of food products. The other issue, I think, when it comes to risks is, are these going to be regulated? And right now, they are regulated. They are tested. It depends on the type of genetic modification as to how much regulation. Is it just safety testing or is there anything else? And so those are important things to know, and you can read about those. But really, we, as humans and consumers, we generally aren't the ones that are consuming these genetically modified foods. So most of us, if the genetic modification is done in the plant, it's often not the protein that's expressed in the food that we're eating. So it might change the plant itself, but not actually the product that we're eating. The other thing is most of these genetically modified foods that are currently used, like cotton and corn and soybeans, they aren't for human consumption. So they're used more as animal feed. I just can't imagine that if a pig is going to eat this genetically modified corn, that somehow it's going to cause a problem in the pig, that when we eat the pork, it's going to cause us trouble. That's far removed from where the genetic modification actually happened in the plant. And then some other people point out that most of the genetically modified soybean products, the amount that goes into the foods that we eat is very, very small. So keeping in mind that even in the current food supply in the United States, there might be a lot of crops that are genetically modified, but the actual genetic modification isn't in the food supply very much. What does that mean for us? I think that, you could go either way on it. I always say it's never a wrong choice. But I do think that there are certainly more important things that we need to focus on when it comes to a nutritious diet. I think that it is essential that everybody has access to nutritious and affordable food. And if that means that we empower farmers to use whatever technology is available to them and helps them produce good quality food wherever they are, that's what I want. So it might be combining technologies from GMOs and from conventional farming and from organic farming. I think that we can all learn from each other, and by combining those all together, each farmer and producer will figure out what works best for their product. So having an open conversation with people who produce our food is really important. So here is my bottom line. First of all, when it comes to genetically modified foods, there are only 8 genetically modified foods approved and produced in the U.S., and they are corn, soybean, cotton, potatoes, canola, papaya, apple, and sugar beet. And that's it. I think there are also more important choices that you can make that have far bigger impact on your health than GMO versus non-GMO. So to me, GMO versus non-GMO is a small issue. What we want you to do is to make sure that you get plenty of fruits, vegetables, whole grains, nuts and seeds, other plant foods, because that's what we know will help decrease your risk for cancer and other diseases. And it also promotes your general well-being. So when we focus in on those things, then these little issues, you can pick your choice, but they're not the most important things. And the other thing is, I think that we can all take a step back and we don't have to make anyone else feel badly about their choices. So, we try to be nice and respectful. And if somebody wants to avoid GMOs, you can buy organic, because organic foods are they're not allowed to use genetically modified seeds. But I think that the other issue is that there's often a label that's placed on things that they're GMO or non-GMO, and there's not currently a legal aspect to that. And so it's really just marketing, which is the same thing that we see with all kinds of other foods. Just because it says non-GMO doesn't say anything about the health or nutrition of the product. And oftentimes it's just a distraction. So if you think about, okay, were your oats labeled non-GMO? Well, there's no such thing as a genetically modified oat. There's actually no such thing as a genetically modified wheat in the US. So they're testing it currently, but it's not available commercially. So if somebody is claiming, that's genetically modified wheat and it's not good for you, that's not even a possibility. So sometimes we're just very confused about what the facts are. So I really caution you to try to pick out the facts, get down to the science behind it, and then make your choice for yourself. Feel confident in your choice, but don't necessarily feel like everybody has to make the same choice. So that's it for today. Thank you for listening. I always love to hear your feedback or suggestions for future topics. Next time, I'm going to talk about supplements and whether they have a role in cancer survivorship and risk reduction. So you'll want to check out for that one. Be sure that you find me over at cancerdietitian.com and on social media. I'm at Cancer Dietitian on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. Please share this episode with your friends and encourage them to subscribe to the Cancer Dietitian podcast. Thanks, and see you later.